Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
At the Wyoming Secretary of State's office with Secretary of State Ed Murray. He's been in his job now for about a year and a half. We'll talk elections, voter registration, even the economy. That's next on Wyoming Chronicle. It's our pleasure to welcome to Wyoming Chronicle Secretary of State Ed Murray. Welcome to Wyoming Chronicle, Mr. Secretary.
Craig, it's good seeing you.
It's always good to see you.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you for having us today. We're very interested in Wyoming's current records in regards to voting and your efforts to get out the vote in Wyoming, to increase voter registration. The statistical trend in Wyoming is that fewer people have been voting year by year, election by election in Wyoming, and your office is very concerned about it. And that's where I'd like to start.
That's a good place to start, And going back, if I may, to a year and 3 months ago when I took office, the narrative at that time, Craig, was that Wyoming looked pretty good, in terms of turnout, voter turnout, certainly nationally. And the records would have reflected at that time that, dating back to like the early 2000s, Wyoming ranked maybe even the top 5 or so for states in the nation. But what I had discovered prior to being elected into office was a real disconnect out on the street. I mean, campaigning and traveling the state of Wyoming. And I wanted to test what the numbers really were when I took office. And so starting a year ago, I started to dig in to the numbers, and I was shocked, Craig, to learn that, for example, in Wyoming, 18 to 24-year-olds, only 10% of that voting population, about 55,000 voter eligible in that age range, but only 10% voted in 2014. And so immediately I started to put as a priority and as a platform increasing voter turnout among our youth, because it was heartbreaking, in fact disheartening, while out on the street and meeting to hear these our youth saying that they weren't interested in the election process.
Before we continue on, why is that?
Oh,
you think when they're 18 they can finally vote, they want to go register.
Yeah.
That was our path was right to do that when we were
and that's the way you were as a young man,
sure.
I'm sure, and I was as well.
What are they telling you?
Well, several things. And just by way of background, I wanted to dig in deep as to what it is that is causing them not to turn out. And so we have gone in a very systematic and professional way to try and ascertain the answers to this. And we are engaging in a scientific survey right now as we speak through Wyoming WYSAC. It's a very scientific, where we're reaching out to this demographic and asking them specifically why they don't vote. Now, I can share with you that as a result of a roundtable that I conducted, and this was just earlier this year in January, that was comprised of about 22 leaders across the state. This included people from education department, government, businessmen and women, the military, and then most importantly, our youth. We gathered together and asked the question, why aren't they voting? And some of the input that we received at that point is that it could be attributable in part to a lack of a rigorous civics education. Okay, and so in Wyoming right now, it's elective for those in senior or junior high school.
So they may not even know the process.
They may not even know the process. And there are some elective programs like We the People that are very rigorous and really get in deep into what it means to be a good citizen and why it's important to participate and to be informed. And there's a correlating turnout among those who participate in We the People and then vote of 93%. And so, to get back to your question, why it could be because of a lack of a rigorous civics education. We also know that there's a disconnect in the way our youth communicate and the voting process right now. I mean, everything that our youth does or do involves electronics, and of course,
their phone.
And the voting process simply is not an electronic process, certainly not currently in history.
Do you see that changing? Are there opportunities to, you must have contemplated then the next question, how do we reach these young people through their electronic medias? What are your thoughts?
Well, there are several ways to reach the young people. And just by way of background, we are leading in a process to reaching them. We're leading towards a statewide summit. From the roundtable, we're gathering the survey information and then anticipate having a statewide summit this fall that will involve hundreds of our youth over in Laramie, where they will be. You know, there's upwards of 10,000 youth between 18 and 24 in Albany County. Now, with respect to electronics, what's going on nationally? First and foremost, electronics are being utilized in the voter registration process across the nation. There's ways to register online and electronically. Wyoming hasn't gone there yet. I think that is possibly, with input and approval and buy-in by the county clerks, I think that is a possibility in Wyoming. And it would have to be a very deliberate and well-vetted discussion that gets into things like cost and certainly have the support of the county clerks. The county clerks throughout the state of Wyoming, are in charge of the registration process. Let there be no mistake about that. And so, but the discussion is, in fact, started in these regards.
What feedback have you gotten, at least initially in your first year and few months of being in office, from county clerks? It seems so easy to walk in the county clerk's office in any town and register. Obviously, though, for young folks, that's not working right now. So any feedback, at least early on, in their thoughts on how to solve this problem?
Well, let me go back and your question, your statement in your question is that so far that's not working. And I want to be clear about what's not working. What's not working is our youth showing up to vote, okay? I don't believe, and the feedback that I have, and I believe this, and it's supported by studies across the nation. Pew, for example, did a study that tries to correlate whether or not increased voter registration leads to increased voter turnout. And although it's counterintuitive, the studies show that's not the case. So I do believe the registration process is working. It's a simple process. And in fact, it has been, our clerks, and I believe in deferring to clerks pursuant to my philosophy of local government and that which is best, which is closer, and let them determine specific programs or initiatives that they want to do with respect to registration, okay? The registration process, it's same day. I mean, it's a simple process. You don't even need, it's just very, very simple. That's not the problem with the system, okay? With the lack of voter turnout. I believe it has to do with a disengagement, a cynicism, an lack of interest in politics. The parties have responsibility in this, you know, whether or not the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, whether or not they have great candidates. There's a lot of things that are driving this problem.
Are you of the opinion now that Wyoming is in an economic downturn, that it's probably more important than ever that young people especially try to understand issues relative to what their vote means and to not feel as disenfranchised because their future now depends on it?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
You know, the youth who are suggesting that they'll let the gray hairs, you know, as I'm affectionately referred to, handle things. You know, that's a mistake, because our youth absolutely have to be part of the future of the state. In fact, the old cliche, the youth are our future, I don't agree with that. The youth are our present. I mean, they are certainly the future, but they're present right now and able to participate and need to participate.
This segues well to the next issue. There's an issue with women in Wyoming wanting to become involved in politics. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily a voting issue, but it is an issue. Wyoming's legislature, as you know, is underrepresented and is, as far as women are concerned, the least represented in the United States. What's your message to young women who have been maybe not as willing to step up in the process, whether it is with their vote or even whether it is to file for an office and run?
Well, Craig, you've hit a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and let me disclose my bias in these regards. You know, I'm a father of 4 daughters, and then I'm intimately aware of what you just represented, and that's accurate, that Wyoming is the least represented in terms of women representation in the nation. And it's not good. It's not good. Women have an important, vital, critical, essential voice in Wyoming and in the nation. And Wyoming, especially Wyoming, you know, the equality state, women's suffrage, it's very upsetting to me, quite frankly, that there are not more women in our state government. And so I think we have 13 or so out of the 90 collectively, mm-hmm. House and Senate. And that is just an extreme underrepresentation. So I think it is a problem. And I would encourage women, let your voice be heard, participate, and bring to the table all those skills, those talents, those gifts with which you have been blessed, not because of your gender, mm-hmm. but because of the perspective that you bring as women. And I can tell you, in my household,
you're outnumbered in many votes in your household, I'm sure.
Yes, and so I know about being the minority.
Uh-huh.
But I'll tell you, it's a blessing, and blessed am I among women, and I encourage all women to get involved.
Mr. Secretary, I want to talk about presidential politics for a moment, if I could. Wyoming does not participate in the primary election process, rather it's a caucus state. Why is that, and what are your thoughts about that?
Well, as to your first question, why is that? It's because that's the tradition, that's the system that Wyoming has enjoyed and has a long history of. Now, The caucus process, having just gone through the presidential presidential caucus process in Wyoming, we saw some perhaps shortcomings or some flaws in that caucus process, which in fact will lead to a legislative interim study to explore the possibility of going to a primary process as opposed to a caucus. Now, what we learned here in the Office of Secretary of State during the recent caucus process was that there was a lot of frustration and a lot of confusion. His long and drawn out, and we received just countless calls on the process, and trying to understand it is so misunderstood. And so the biggest complaint was that my voice wasn't heard. I went to vote for a presidential candidate and end up in a room that was jam-packed that never even allowed me to vote for a candidate. There was options to vote for delegates, and it was just a confusing process. So I welcome and encourage a discussion to explore the possibility of a primary in Wyoming. However, it would necessitate input and total participation and involvement from the county clerks, certainly from the legislature, from the citizens of Wyoming, and last but very importantly, the political parties themselves. And it would necessitate, real deep discussion about the cost of a primary, who would bear that. So there's a lot of pros and cons, but generally I'm for participation. I'm for getting people excited and involved in the process. And so I'm not so sure the caucus process best facilitates that end objective.
That said, are you more in favor of a primary then at this point?
I'm definitely in favor of exploring the possibility of the primary. To make a fully informed, intelligent decision, I would need to absolutely have input from the clerks, know about the costs, visit with the parties, and I would feel ill-equipped to make an informed decision until that time.
Mr. Secretary, you're a year and a half into your tenure in your first term as Secretary of State. What are the biggest changes in your office?
We've had incredible changes.
Share some of those with us.
Well, keep in mind that the Office of Secretary of State has 5 divisions, and I liken it to a hand that reaches out and touches a number of very critical and important aspects of living and doing business in Wyoming. The first division is the business division, and here is where we've seen some going into the modernization. It's been an incredible first year. And so when I took office, just by way of background, 8 of the 9 processes that any business entity registered to do business in Wyoming had with the Secretary of State's office was paper. And it was a bad way of doing business, not only for those to whom we are responsible and trying to accommodate businessmen and women in the circumstances and in the way they do business, but in the Office of Secretary of State there was mountains and mountains of paperwork under which our people were being buried, and that the morale was bad. The turnover was high in the business division, and understandably so. I went in there, did a 100-day assessment, a plan, and we came out of it recognizing that we must go electronic. And so I'm very pleased to report to you that we are going electronic, and in fact have made several deployments of modules that have gone from this old antiquated paper processing to electronic. And it's made all the difference. Morale is through the sky, turnover is eliminated, people are happy, our customers are happy, and it's reaching out and meeting them on their terms. Okay, that's in the business division. Let me add, by the way, that we did this at zero cost to the taxpayers. This idea of modernizing had been looked at before, and it had been reported and estimated the cost of doing so would be $8 to $12 million. We did it for zero.
Did you just use in-house resources to accomplish that process?
No, a combination. We started by not reinventing the wheel. This $8 to $12 million was the cost that had been looked at in terms of creating
starting from scratch.
And we reached out and simply understood that there are other states in the nation who are offering these services. They've already created the modules. We reached out and asked for and received them. And so that's what we're doing. It is incredible. With respect to moving on to this hand, the second division is our compliance division. Important division. We have over 90,000 stock brokers, and those involved in the securities business registered to do business in Wyoming. Not all of them living here, understand.
Mm-hmm.
But we had a rewrite this last legislative session during the budget session. This is a monumental success. The Securities Act was 50 years old. And so we modernized the Securities Act and have now an up-to-date, similar to, that enables those registered to do business in Wyoming to keep up with what's going on around the country. And so one of the most exciting things that came out of this legislation was crowdfunding. Now, I'm a businessman, okay? 25, 30 years ago when I started off, I had nothing. A used pickup truck for collateral. I go into a bank with my business plan, an idea for financing a project and whatnot. My banker could look across, judge my plan, judge my character, bank on me. Okay, that's not possible. Dodd-Frank, all the federal rules and regulations that exist now make it impossible for young businessmen and women or new entrepreneurs who have no capital, who have no assets to get the financing. And so this crowdfunding is an alternative source of financing that will allow new businessmen and women to receive capital. And I think it's going to be very beneficial for our young entrepreneurs, new entrepreneurs, especially in these downtimes that Wyoming is going to be facing. Moving on, quickly, elections, big deal. We've talked a lot about that, our initiative to increase voter turnout across the demographics, but especially where it's so abysmally unacceptable with our youth. That must change. And then our new partnership with the clerks of the counties. This is something that when I took office, they asked for and wanted to know that they would have our unconditional support going into these incredibly challenging election cycles. And Craig, let me tell you, these the running of an election, save for a military exercise, when you have the mobilization and the deployment for an election cycle, there's nothing that demands as much logistical and planning as an election cycle. And the clerks have our full support in this process. It's exciting.
We have just a few seconds left, Secretary of State Murray, and I would be remiss. We talked a little bit about the economy just briefly, but you must have some thoughts on Wyoming's downturn here and your hopes for its future. As we conclude today, what have you thought about recently in the face of job layoffs across the state of Wyoming?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to express my most heartfelt condolences for those families. Many of whom I have met who are experiencing layoffs, and I'm very pleased to report, however, and I'm an optimist, and I believe Wyoming is a state that will rebound through this down cycle stronger than ever. We're positioned, actually, Craig, as a state to go into this downturn and to go through this downturn in a much stronger position than in any previous downturn. We have many, many good things that we can continue to bank on, including the tourism industry, which is setting records right now and will continue to do so. We have our ag business, which is very strong in Wyoming. We have new diversification in terms of data storage and all those types of entrepreneurial directions that we can head. I, for one, believe that Wyoming will weather this storm and come out of it very strong.
We appreciate that optimism, Mr. Secretary. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
Wyoming
so
Chronicle.
much. Really appreciate it, Craig.